Greetings and welcome to the United States Transhumanist Party Virtual Enlightenment Salon. My name is Gennady Stolyarov II, and I am the chairman of the U.S. Transhumanist Party. Here we hold conversations with some of the world's leading thinkers in longevity, science, technology, philosophy, and politics. Like the philosophers of the Age of Enlightenment, we aim to connect every field of human endeavor and arrive at new insights to achieve longer lives, greater rationality, and the progress of our civilization. Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our virtual Enlightenment Salon of January 15th, 2022. Today, we hope to bring you a multifaceted discussion that involves subjects such as the study of pandemics and anticipating the course of the present pandemic which we are unfortunately living through, as well as rejuvenation research and research into neurodiversity. We have a distinguished panel today, including our Director of Visual Art, Art Ramon Garcia, our Legislative Director, Jason Geringer, our Director of Longevity Outreach, Ben Ballweg, our Biotechnology Advisor and the founder and CEO of Sierra Sciences, Dr. Bill Andrews, and our special guest today is Dr. Ian Hale, who is a futurist and forecaster. He is also the author of the books Asperger's, Autism, and You, and Corona, the Answer. And he has a PhD degree in humanities and is a member of both Mensa and the Athenian Society for people with IQs of over 180. He is a researcher, public speaker, and writer in areas such as special education, neurodiversity, genetic engineering, life extension, and PTSD. He is a consultant and webcast professional, a trained laboratory chemist, and has continued science since childhood, leading to his support of transhumanism. And also just joining us today is our friend Jason Mercurio of Ageless Partners. We had an excellent virtual Enlightenment Salon with him last year as well. But now I would like to turn this over to Dr. Ian Hale. He is having a bit of an audio connection issue, but I'm going to signal to him to begin his presentation. And Dr. Hale, if you are able to begin with your introductory remarks, please do so. I think he is still muted. He is still muted. So we're going to let him resolve those issues. And in the meantime, I want to ask Dr. Bill Andrews, since you have been looking at the course of the COVID pandemic extensively over the past several years, what can you tell us about the current situation in terms of the spread of the Omicron subvariants and the likely future course of the pandemic?
Well, let me just, I do have a lot of contacts in China. I have business relationships, things like that. And I am getting the most horrible emails from them where all their friends are dying and there's massive numbers of people getting infected and getting really sick. And everybody's relatives and kids and family members are getting all sick. And it's a lot worse than what we're hearing in the news. And we're hearing that it's a lot worse than we're hearing in the news too from the news, but it's actually true. The feedback I'm getting from my personal connections are pretty horrible. So there's something really bad going on there with the COVIDs. But I'm not certain what else. In my area right here, I'm kind of surprised that we're still really low. I usually always say that when a big outbreak occurs somewhere else in the world, since it takes like 5 days approximately to actually see symptoms after you get infected, when we see a big outbreak with symptoms somewhere else in the world, we can already say it's already here, okay? Because it spreads pretty fast. But in the last several weeks, I have not seen it go up, at least in my county. I usually that's the only county I monitor, which is Washoe County in Nevada. Um, so I'm not exactly certain what's going on, but I do know that you know, I'd love to play with the DNA sequences from the different variants and align them and try to come up with models to explain how one became another and things like that. So I can't think of anything interesting that's popped up lately. The only thing that came up the last year was the significant difference between like the Delta and the Omicron. The Omicron seemed to be somehow, I want to say almost man-made, because it was like a combination of a lot of other variants. And if I had to guess, and I can only guess, I'd have to say that somebody tried to create a safe SARS-CoV-2 virus, and that's what the Omicron was. But they didn't take into account things that are in the like spike protein that actually interfere with immune responses. The spike protein is known to contain a domain in it that actually interferes with something called the non-homologous end-joining enzyme that is actually involved in shuffling DNA fragments in the V, D, and J regions of our chromosomes. I'm probably getting too technical, but it's when you induce an immune response to something, that's the only place in humans where we will actually shuffle our DNA, okay, or have different versions of DNA get created. So when we say that every cell in our body has the same DNA except like red blood cells, that's not true in these immune cells, because there's these regions called V, D, and J that shuffle to create the part of the antibody that actually recognizes the invader, called the antigen. But the V, D, and J is partially made by using this enzyme called the non-homologous end-joining enzyme, abbreviated NHEJ for short. And the spike protein actually contains a domain in it that inhibits that enzyme. So it's really hard. So even the Novavax vaccine, which I think is probably the best vaccine out, it still has that problem with the inhibitor. And it's easy to design spike proteins that have that NHEJ inhibitor domain knocked out. It's just nobody's done it yet, and it's because nobody wants to spend all the money to create a whole new vaccine. Is all I can guess. But there's lots of people that know all about it, lots of people that can design these things, and I'm just surprised that nobody has. But if I had several billion dollars, that's what I would do. I would create a new vaccine that has the spike protein and has the NHEJ inhibitor domain knocked out. I can't think of anything else to say unless people have questions.
Yes, thank you, Bill. This is quite fascinating, and I do have a few questions for you before we go to Dr. Hale. And my first question is, with regard to the vaccine that hypothetically would have this inhibitor knocked out, would that vaccine then confer permanent immunity, or at least long-lasting immunity, against any possible SARS-CoV-2 strain that might emerge in the future?
Well, it depends. I mean, if the new variants have a similar spike protein, yeah, then it will confer. And it should work just as good as any traditional vaccine, which gives you pretty much lifelong protection usually. I just saw somebody mention the Sinovac vaccine. That actually is my favorite strategy, the Sinovac, because that's essentially a whole virus, a killed virus. So you have more than just a spike protein, but it's not working. It's like, and I think it's probably because of this domain in the spike protein. So the Sinovac vaccine with the NHEJ domain knocked out probably would end up being the best vaccine on the planet. And they just have to work. So Ian just mentioned something about the Sinovac. Let me just read what he says. Yes, he says less than 40% effective. Yeah, that's been true ever since it first came out. Sinovac vaccine was was the main vaccine in Turkey. And so I have a lot of connections in Turkey, and I was getting reports of people saying how wonderful it's working, but it only works wonderful on some people, not others. And I think it's because that domain ended up interfering with some people being able to generate the correct immune response. The old vaccines keep breeding more variants to dodge the vaccines. Well, that's the hearsay. It's hard to really understand how that's happening. It's also hard to understand why new variants come along and then the old variants disappear. It's all like guesswork as to what's going on there. But anything's possible right now. But the scientific literature hasn't really come up with a good case of where the vaccines are actually inducing the new variants. But theoretically, it's possible. Sorry.
Yes. Interesting to consider. Now, I have one more question for you, Bill, and then Jason Mercurio has a question. My question is, where do you get the data to track the recent numbers of cases in Washoe County? And is that data source also available for other counties in Nevada or other locations in the United States? Because recently, as of about a year ago, the state of Nevada discontinued offering really detailed day-by-day COVID statistics, and I was relying on those statistics to really keep track.
Somebody's knocking on my window right now because the door's locked. Let me just go let him in. Hold on.
All right. So as I was saying, during the early pandemic, it was actually quite convenient to keep track of the number of cases, the distribution of cases throughout the state of Nevada, the number of deaths, the demographics of the deaths, and by county, I could see essentially week by week, if not day by day, what the risk was. And I could time my travel, I could time my participation in various public events. So during a lull in COVID cases, I would be able to be more social and be out and about.
I'm back.
Yes. So it would be nice, Bill, to have a way of tracking cases and close to real time. And it seems that you have some data sources that you're using. What are you using?
Well, everybody does. And pretty much the easiest thing to do is just in your search window on Google, just type COVID dashboard and then COVID space dashboard space and wherever you want. And you'll see a lot of things, but I would go to the ones that start off with GIS. I forget what GIS stands for, but those provide all the data. The major, and if you look at that data, you'll see, and because they give you a kind of an Excel file that you can download and you can crunch all the numbers. That's pretty much showing how many people are infected in their county, in the particular area or county, how many people are dying, how many of the people are vaccinated, things like that. And it's showing that like always over 50%, sometimes as high as 90% of the new cases are vaccinated people, which is bad news for the vaccines. But and the other thing about vaccines, it's been lots of studies now have been showing that the side effects, mostly the cardiovascular blood clotting side effects, are very genetic. Okay, so people who are predisposed to cardiovascular disease genetically are at a much higher risk of having the side effects that the vaccines can induce. And that's true for all the vaccines that require producing the antigen inside of the cells. Okay, so which is not traditional. Vaccines need to be made, the antigen has to be outside the cell, not inside the cell, to really induce an immune response. Of course, even when it's outside the cell, it gets inside the cell and presented on the surface by antigen presenter cells. But it's got to go through a process to get there. So I'm sorry, I'm getting off track again, but I wasn't prepared to address this issue. But the vaccines. Let's see, where were we? Okay, so if you go to that data, go to just do a Google search for COVID dashboard and whatever you want to do, you'll find things that start off with GIS, and that's where you can get all the data. But there's even better sites that you can go to that I can actually go and email people, where you can actually get the DNA sequences. You can stay on top of the research that's underway. You can bypass what the politicians are saying and hear what the scientists that actually are working at the lab bench on them are saying. But I can't, I don't have those off the top of my head here. But it's just, I work with other people that are obsessed with keep following all this data too. So, but what was I saying? The genetic people that are genetically predisposed to cardiovascular disease are much higher risk of getting blood clots if they use one of the vaccines that are delivered like as a gene therapy. So the ones that actually use a virus to deliver the gene, so the RNA and DNA ones, that's the best way to describe it. The ones that deliver an RNA or DNA, they contain ingredients that actually induce blood clots in some people. The ones that don't, let's say Sinovac and Novavax, they actually are traditional vaccines where you're delivering the protein to the blood. Those don't, there's no data really showing that they have high risk of causing blood clots and stuff. Of course, knock on wood, I might look today and find out that there's now data saying there is, but they shouldn't. So let's see, did somebody just text me something?
I got a quick question for you, Bill.
Good.
No, thank you. Very, very well said. And kind of tying into what you were saying, people with high risk of cardiovascular disease, potentially getting some blood clots or potentially a side effect from the vaccine. What are your thoughts on this sudden death syndrome, thing that I've heard about it? And, it's always like the entire pandemic, we've kind of seen this, two sides to every kind of coin. And really throughout the whole US, we've seen this divide, this massive amount of misinformation. And amongst the general public, there's huge amounts of confusion. So when I look at this sudden death syndrome thing that people have been talking about, they were saying that it's like athletes who I would think are not having cardiovascular issues to begin with. Like they're very in shape, they're very athletic. So could there be something in their biology that is causing that? Or do you think maybe it's the data or the people are misled or kind of what are your thoughts on that in particular?
Well, I mean, I think the only reason why it's showing up more in athletes is because it becomes more big news when it happens to an athlete. But it's also that the sudden death is often associated with intense heart muscle use. So that's another reason why athletes would have it. But it is genetic. I mean, so sudden death doesn't have to be a cardiovascular problem. It can be a cardiology problem, okay, which would be just like heart muscle or something like that. That's not functioning right. So that's a very broad subject, and but it's genetic. Okay, it's like usually when you hear about some high school kid dying while playing a basketball game from sudden death syndrome or whatever, it's usually that there's some genetic issue that person has. But
thank you.
I don't answer your question, but
No,
I haven't been following that specifically. I've just been following cardiovascular disease.
I'm wondering if some of the sudden death can be caused by COVID itself. So if someone had COVID, and most people have had COVID in some form by now, and even if that COVID was in a mild form, one of the long-lasting consequences could be a heart arrhythmia, and a heart arrhythmia could lead to cardiac arrest, even if there is no cardiovascular disease. So the arteries could be clear, but an abnormal heart rhythm could send the heart into fibrillation and the athlete could die unless emergency medical attention is administered. Do you see any possibility for that being the cause, not necessarily the vaccines, but COVID itself, that would have led to conduction system abnormalities in the heart.
Yeah, oh no, absolutely. I think that the chances that the virus itself is going to cause those problems is like 1,000 times higher than the vaccines.
Yes, yes. And I think that's an important point, because I do think the vaccines have protected a lot of people, perhaps not to the extent that we had hoped, but given the immense number of cardiovascular side effects and electrical side effects to the heart after COVID, I think it is still very important to try not to get COVID if one can. And Dr. Hale says it's more likely the performance-enhancing drugs that the athletes were taking. Dr. Hale, do you want to speak with regard to your thoughts on the COVID pandemic and what you have learned about it in the course of your study of historical pandemics, as well as this pandemic and the course it's likely to take, in your view?
Yes. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes.
Ah, that's great. The problem was a browser fault here, which I've been able to fix. Okay. Yeah, I got to say I kind of disagree with a lot of what's been said. Myself and my colleague Dr. Green wrote a report for the UK government, advising them what to do, bearing in mind that right back in 2005 and 2006, both President George Bush in 2005 to the United States Congress, and the head of the WHO, as well as Bill Gates in 2006, warned the world that a pandemic was coming. Now, the reasons behind that, a lot of it is social. When you have poor health services, overcrowded houses, despoiled environments, and a medical profession and a population that have become so incredibly complacent because there hadn't been a major outbreak of anything since the 1969 to 1970 flu epidemic, that sooner or later, one of three viral groups would throw up a new strain. It happened to be the coronavirus. Now, when you look back in history, you take the Marseille plague, 1701 to 1702. Fascinating study because of where it's contained and the way, and the containment of it. But the Great Plague of London is another really good example. The Plague of Justinian, if we want to go back 2,500 years, which basically ended the power of Athens as a major power, because the plague kept they were within their siege city. The Spartans were outside, and basically something like this event occurred, a viral event, which went through the population and weakened it, which allowed, as the water became more difficult, food became more difficult because of the Spartan siege, other diseases then took over, and in the end they were sufficiently weakened that the Spartans walked through the gate. And each time you look at a viral outbreak, and I'm perfectly aware that the plague in London and so forth was bacterial, just in case. I do know that Bacillus pestis is a bacterial infection, but you look at all the viral ones, and now let's look at the American flu, 1917, 1920, that killed many more people than the Great War did from 1914 to 1918. That began in America in the early summer of 1917 and was brought over to Europe with the American troops. And, that's the history of that particular. That was one of the most dangerous viruses of all time. What's interesting about it is that it only killed one person over the age of 40. And typically viruses kill younger people, these kind of viral outbreaks. Partly that might be because previous generations have experienced similar viri and therefore have at least some residual immunity. The other thing that we learn from history is that viral epidemics typically have a 4-year life cycle. Now, we developed all these amazing vaccines. I was not myself. Dr. Green was very involved in developing the Oxford Zeneca vaccine, which was fantastically effective vaccine. But in the same way as rats have managed to evolve in order to be resistant to rat poison, a virus is able to evolve to become resistant or to find ways around vaccines. Bearing in mind the replication rate of corona is about 6 weeks. So it's evolving every 6 weeks, more or less. And it's always going to be a step ahead of vaccines. But after 2 years, everybody got so unbelievably complacent again. I mean, people never learn. They would never do. People like myself, medical scientists, were warning governments about long COVID, and they were ignored. And in my book, I've written that COVID will knock away the world's supply chains, because basically you've got so many sick people now that it's our very transport networks are under siege. And we can't afford to do this. And yet all the restrictions, the masking restrictions, the enclosed space restrictions, the intensive advertising for people to get their vaccinations, a particularly vicious strain of flu this year. People have been pushed to get their flu vaccines. They haven't done it. We're making the perfect storm here. And my guess is that a lot of the sudden deaths blamed on the COVID vaccines have actually been caused by this flu strain combined with COVID, because of the way that flu acts on the body. I mean, this is a particularly nasty type A strain. The particular part of the world I live in, which is Northwest Wales, had the lowest vaccination rate and, strangely enough, the highest death rate. And I don't know, 500-600 yards down the road, there's a vaccination center that's open 24/7. Every day of the year. And there are big plaques outside, and they see maybe 7 people a day. People haven't bloody learned. And it amazes me how that is the case. The answer, the book's called Corona, the Answer. And one of the answers that I put forward is that people have to take a lot more responsibility for their own health and their own well-being, bearing in mind the effects of viral infections, one of which is dehydration, and that also will or can indeed occasion heart problems. People are not being socially responsible. They aren't masking, they're not distancing, they're not getting vaccinated, they're not taking the right supplements. They're continuing to drink. I speak only in my local area, insane amounts of alcohol, and we know the problems that causes with the immune system. I get a little tired of hearing pharmaceutical companies getting blamed for everything, and the fact that individuals and governments don't seem to want to take any responsibility for the lack of action that people like myself have been recommending to them since the first deaths of COVID. and the lockups were insane. Yeah, great. Crowd together a lot of people, make sure that you can get every combination of that virus recombining into new variants, and then yeah, let them out all over the world. You know, let them travel on trains and boats and aircraft. You know, let them go to cinemas and karaoke's and everything else. Yeah, that's really, really stupid. And that was why I came to warn about the second wave that I said would start early this year. Mr. Mercurio has seen the video that I did for Indian TV about 10 days ago, because someone there had read the book and thought, wow, you know, he predicted exactly that this would happen. And the result is, because, you know, the unbelievable, as I say, I've now used it for the third time, but the complacency and the arrogance of the majority of people in the Western world, and the fact that governments are too frightened to upset people's feelings, too frightened to say, look, you know, this is what medical science is saying, we're going to do this. And unless we do take the bull by the horns here and stop in its tracks the spread of COVID, then the Western supply chain will snap. We will not have power. We will not have food. We will not have medical supplies. We will not be able to be getting people to hospital because we won't have the fuel supplies, the gas supplies. You know, and that's what I said in the book, and that's what I said in the broadcast. It is time people woke up and realized that this was a world-changing event. I mentioned at the beginning that my first PhD was in humanities. I was a history specialist, which is really how I came to study the history of diseases. And one of the things you learn from history is that plagues have been the biggest contributors to change in history. You know, everyone thinks of war and, you know, brave leaders and knights in armor and the crashing of the guns and the sounding of the trumpets. But when you really want to get down to what changed things on a socio-economic basis, and indeed on a population basis in terms of things like migration, then study the great plagues of history and the effects they had. Okay, we'll maybe talk about more of this later, but you know, I think it's time that governments and societies took some responsibility for their own stupidities and the fact that they don't want to listen to people like us. I mean, they hate people like us, you know? I don't know why, but they do.
Well, thank you for your remarks, and I think it's worthwhile to explore this subject in some detail. Now, Daniel Tweed has an interesting question. He writes, how can we vaccinate our way of something that makes a new variant every 6 weeks? It seems to Daniel that the current course of action is not particularly efficacious. And I do sympathize with that statement. I was vaccinated 4 times with the Moderna vaccine. It did not prevent me from catching Omicron BA.5, the subvariant, which is now diminishing in prevalence because an even more contagious set of subvariants are replacing it, in particular XBB 1.5, which is the most contagious yet. And there are some estimates that 80% of Americans will catch XBB 1.5 because it evades prior immunity due to vaccinations or from prior infection. So what personal precautions would you recommend for people during especially this challenging time when there's a strain circulating that can negate any previous protection that one might have built up?
Well, I recommend, first of all, that people get vaccinated, because at least, you know, because we now have another dominant strain, it doesn't mean that the other strains haven't gone away. I certainly recommend that people should get their flu vaccinations. I certainly recommend that people should make sure that they keep their magnesium and zinc at good levels, because they're very important for the immune system. And stay out of crowded pubs, and don't go to cinemas, and don't go to, big indoor meetings. And when you go into a shop, try to go in at off-peak times to avoid crowds. And when you do, mask, wear at least a decent surgical three-layer mask. That's my, and get out and try to have a walk in the fresh air every day, because you're not going to catch it out in the open air. It's very important that yeah, good point, Jason Guringer. We don't have to go around hugging, kissing, and shaking hands with each other. Everyone talks about going back to normal. One of the main points I make in the book is that there is no going back to normal. All right. This ongoing epidemic has changed the world, is changing the world, and will continue to do so until it has run its natural course. Okay. And we have to be aware of that on a 24/7 basis. And we have to reorganize our health and social systems in a way that I explain in the book, to adapt to the post-pandemic world when it comes, which I'm guessing is going to be a while.
How long do you think it will take for the pandemic to fully run its course? And what will the post-pandemic world look like? You said there's no going back to normal. Will certain practices need to be different even after the pandemic is over by any reasonable evaluation of that?
Yeah. As I say, the normal life cycle of a virus is normally about 4 years. I would declare the pandemic over when there have been no significant outbreaks for a 12-month period. Until then, we should be masking, we should be sanitizing, we should be doing everything that we did at the I say at the height of the pandemic, but take Britain at the moment. We have 3 times more people in hospital with COVID now than the entire number of people that had to go to hospital since the beginning of the epidemic. And that is true of a lot of countries, certainly true of Spain. I know that since the new president was elected, the mainstream media seem very reluctant to talk about the COVID figures, but I've got enough contacts, a family in America, that I know that it is ripping through parts of the South in a way that's not been seen before. I've got family in Tennessee, and what they're describing is, well, a scene out of Dante. The same with Northern Cyprus, where I was in the spring and early summer of last year. They've refused to vaccinate, and now 80% of the population is either sick and working or sick and not working, and basically the islands come to a halt. No, we in the post-pandemic world, let's say in 2005, 2006, all right? I mean, we are going to have to fundamentally change the way that we look at our lives. From the Second World War up until the start of this pandemic, the Western world in particular placed its highest value on quantity of life. Having that bigger house, having that bigger car, having that, whatever else. And, infrastructure got neglected, and a lot of other things that shouldn't have happened did. And I think what we have to do now is to change our attitudes and demand quality of life. Demand that we spend $1 trillion a year not on killing our fellow human beings, but on developing greater medical science, more cooperative medical science across the world's borders, and to realize that we are on this planet together, and the next plague, and that isn't far away, because as the ice caps are melting, then more viri, more bacteria that we have no defense against, that we haven't seen in 10 to 12,000 years, will emerge, as the world continues to warm. And unless we all work together and we devote sufficient resources into building the right kind of housing, making sure that everyone has high quality food, making sure that we create strong people, not a situation, where you've got a third of the population living, virtually at the UN poverty line. In Britain at the moment, right, every hospital in the country has got 4 food banks attached to it. That's how bad it is here. And I've heard horror stories from America. I've seen things when I was I lived in Spain for a period of time. I saw things during the beginning, the first year of the pandemic over there that I'll never forget, sadly. Bodies laid outside of makeshift morgues, at the end of March and April in Spain, when it's pretty darn warm, and then the relatives would have to come and open the bags to identify them. I tell you, you did not want to be downwind of that. These were outside of ice rinks, and the ice rinks were piled high with the dead because there were no longer rooms in the mortuaries. And these were in the car parks and just left there. That's when you really realize why you became a doctor. You know what I'm saying? Because no one had bothered to properly pay for health services. There weren't the facilities, and we have got to consider, and this will go in nicely to what I know Mr. Mercurio wants to talk about later, and myself as well, that we have got to stop valuing things over valuing life. It seems to me absolutely insane that we have countries that we know for a fact are hiding medical research on COVID. I'm not going to name any, but you out there, who you are. We have got to develop a completely different attitude and realize it's us as a species against the coming plagues, against this plague, and we have got to fight it as one, because if we don't hang together, for sure, we are going to hang one after the other.
Yes, it is important and imperative for the human species to unite in the fight against COVID, and hopefully your remarks will help to motivate that. Jason Mercurio has a comment, so Jason, please proceed.
Thank you, appreciate it. Yeah, it's an interesting thing that we saw here in the U.S. We really saw widespread disagreements amongst, in particular, the political parties. Everything became very political, and even the vaccine and masks. And we've seen this across the board, where it's always the Republicans and the Democrats kind of pointing fingers at each other. One side, in this case for the pandemic, sort of like one side saying, oh, we're for vaccines, the other side saying we're not, and same things with masks. And really our response as a country should have been better. It should have been better. I think our leaders could have done a little better. I know it was a tough situation. Like it wasn't something easy, but like there should have been a better response. And things like this have been predicted, so you would think there'd be a little bit more preparation. And really the core confusion too is I see it as a capital allocation problem. Like the U.S. allocates a certain amount of capital to things every year, and they just haven't put enough into the medical system, into research, into understanding, into being prepared. Not just medical, other technology that's coming into existence in real time so fast, and really they're having trouble keeping up with it. They're having trouble responding. They're buying more and more equipment to be able to defend themselves versus other countries. These huge planes and these new drones, like these new ones that are just coming out, which it could be good to have, but really the disconnect is like how many people are dying from aging in particular. Now, COVID, some people would say, is actually an age-related disease to some degree. COVID does affect elders more than young people, and I think capital should be allocated in that way a little bit more aggressively. And then on top of that, the misinformation was definitely hard. I mean, for the average American, they have no idea to some degree. They're like, shoot, like, do I take this vaccine? Do I not? Do I mask? Do I not? They're very confused. There wasn't an overarching, commonality or sense of, hey, this is what we're all going to do. It was kind of just a back and forth. And like Dr. Ian Hale alluded to, this probably won't be the last pandemic. And there's other risks that are coming to front and center very quickly. And we don't seem like we're quite prepared. To layer on top of that, at least here in the US, we're seeing, widespread obesity. I think the number is above 1 in 3 now here in the US is categorized as obese. And a lot of these diseases that are actually killing the most people in the world, on the planet, that are age-related, dementia, these Alzheimer's, diabetes, these strokes, cardiovascular disease, sort of as the number one. These diseases, like, they didn't necessarily take out as many people, say 200 years ago, right? Before we had all these processed foods, all these additives, all these preservatives. And you really got to follow the money. When you look at all the money that's being spent on essentially creating this information that shows, scientific studies as an example, that certain, organizations essentially might put out into the public, that may or may not be true. And a lot of it's just very misleading. I think it's like 10 big companies, they own pretty much all the processed foods, and they're making a fortune. And even the vaccines, and this is where, I think some of the debate comes in. You look at Pfizer, when they made 20 billion that first time when they hit their highest revenue in a single quarter, everyone was like, wow, Pfizer is doing great. And then everyone's looking back and being like, wait, like, is something else happening here? And I've heard speculation that, and I'm not saying I agree with any of this, but they're saying, oh, they had this vaccine almost ready before the virus came out. Now, obviously there's all these conspiracy theories, and coming, I've heard, and no one really knows, what is true for sure. But anyway, let's hope our system can come together. We're, like Dr. Ian was kind of alluding to, like, we're all in this together. We're all here on the same planet, and hopefully, the U.S. Transhumanist Party can move us forward in the right direction.
Yes, thank you,
Can
Jason.
I just add something in there, Gennady?
Please go ahead.
There was a big debate about how companies were able to, Pfizer was one, AstraZeneca was another, obviously, how companies were able to get those vaccines out so quickly. The fact is, we go back to the early part of this century. We had SARS-1, and then we had MERS, and at both Astra and Pfizer, and actually the Pasteur Institute in France were working on vaccines to, they are coronavirus as well. We're working on vaccines for those from about 2010. So in fact, by the time that these vaccines against this particular corona, SARS-2, came out, in fact, it was just a tweak of something that had taken 10 years to develop. And that's how they were able to respond as quickly as they were.
Yes. This is an excellent point, because the mRNA vaccine technology, as a more general category of technology, also began to be developed before the COVID-19 pandemic. It's just the technology was adapted for the SARS-CoV-2 virus. And it's a good thing that that technology was available, because without it, the pace of vaccine development would have been a lot slower, and many more people would have died during the early stages of the pandemic. We have some interesting comments from our viewers. So Mike Lazine writes that he does not see health organizations and hospitals ever going back to where there is no mask wearing. Now, I am seeing in certain hospitals protocols that the staff are required to wear masks, but the patients, for their convenience, are not. But I agree that most hospitals, at least while this pandemic is ongoing, are going to keep requiring their staff to wear masks. And Alan Crowley has an interesting comment. Essentially, he writes that everybody agrees that the pandemic could have been handled better. However, people disagree on how exactly it could have been handled better. So our response should have been better. Everyone agrees. The disagreement is on which way is better. And that is an ongoing subject of debate, especially as the virus continues to evolve and new strains may challenge strategies that were previously thought to be effective and offered a reasonable amount of protection. Alan Crowley also points out, and Jason emphasized this as well in his remarks, COVID attacks people with comorbid conditions, especially aging, but not always aging-related comorbid conditions. So people who are immunocompromised, for instance, may be attacked by COVID, and there could even be genetic predispositions toward severe COVID infection or long COVID among young and previously healthy individuals as well. So this is a problem for everybody, not just the elderly, though the elderly do face a greater risk of mortality and other severe effects from COVID. Also, several of our viewers have stories that relate to what Dr. Hale narrated his experiences in Spain being. John H. writes, same sort of thing happened in New York City, especially in Queens. They needed refrigerator trucks because the hospital morgues were overflowing with the dead. And in retrospect, this is horrible imagery. Luis Arroyo, who is also from New York City, writes that the local hospital near him did that, and seeing that was definitely odd. But New York City was hit very hard early on during the pandemic, to the point where there were very few supplies, there were very few masks or other personal protective equipment. And yes, there were a lot of situations like that, which is grisly to think about in the 21st century. And I hope we can avoid that happening again. This is why in March of 2020, the US Transhumanist Party proposed rapidly constructing new hospitals to double the hospital capacity in the United States. But unfortunately, that advocacy fell on deaf ears because American mainstream politicians were not actually interested in solving the problem. As Jason pointed out, they were interested in politicizing the problem and creating fault lines between right and left based on people's opinions of how the pandemic should be handled, rather than trying to fix the pandemic definitively. So thank you for those comments. I will pose one more question from one of our viewers, John H., on the subject of COVID, and then we can move on to rejuvenation research. So John H. is wondering about fomite transmission. He writes, we still wipe down things we get delivered, but we're not hearing anything anymore about the virus riding in on soup cans and in the mail. So early on in the pandemic, yes, there was a lot of focus on cleaning surfaces. There was a lot of focus on washing one's hands. And it seems to me the advice from the medical community has evolved away from that, that mostly the advice is avoid close contact with people who might be infectious. What value, if any, is there to cleaning surfaces, cleaning objects, washing hands? Do you think that would contribute significantly to protecting oneself, especially from these new hyper-contagious subvariants like XBB 1.5?
Well, certainly hand washing is very important, but I'm probably going to get into trouble for what I'm about to say, right? But I'm gonna say it anyway because that's kind of who I am. A lot of the he talks about wiping things down that were getting delivered, Amazon parcels, mail, wiping down soup tins that you picked up. Actually, that didn't come from the medical profession. That came from politicians, and the idea was to give people a sense of empowerment and to take their minds off the situation. From a purely medical standpoint, there was never any sense to it, and it didn't mean anything. But yes, keeping your hands clean is very, very important. And also, strangely, one of the things, what people don't realize, they think that COVID enters primarily from the mouth and nose. And that actually isn't true. It enters primarily through the eyes and ears. So, if you can keep your eyes covered, and wear a hat as well, a bobble hat or something. Every little helps. You with a mask, a bobble hat, and I don't know, pair of goggles, whatever you want to wear. That is going to give you the best chance. I'm not going to give out. I mean, I'm aware of the poverty, in my country, in your country, and in the world at large. I'm not going to, sit here, talking across the Atlantic and, giving people advice that's going to cost them, money that they don't have. But, people can make eye protectors. People can, even if it's putting a bit of newspaper in their ears, and wearing a disposable mask or whatever else. I mean, an N95 mask, clearly better. But yeah, keep your hands clean, and make sure you wash your face regularly. And there's what they call the red zone there. Okay, a lot of people, when they wash their face after they've been out to the shops, they don't do this. But when you think about it, that's where most of the spit, if people aren't wearing a mask, is going to go. So it's worth pulling a wet wipe across that, as well as using a wet wipe on your face or on your hands, or soap and water, or one of the alcohol sanitizers. So yeah, you could certainly do that, and yeah, but no, you're not going to pick it up off a can of Campbell's soup or an Amazon package unless the spit is still wet, basically.
Yes. Thank you for those remarks. And actually, when you were speaking, I was reminded of the Microclimate Air 2 helmet. So this was a helmet that was developed, at least the first version was developed in 2020. They've updated it a bit. It covers the head completely, and it has a HEPA filter at the bottom. So it would provide the protection for the eyes and ears that you're discussing. The cost is $299, and I believe it can be delivered in the United States right now. So for anybody who is interested, I don't own one yet. I am seriously thinking about purchasing one, but I don't have any sort of commercial stake in this. This is just one option if you want to protect your eyes and ears, as Dr. Hale said. John H. would like to thank you for your response. It was very helpful.
Thank you.
I also agree it's quite interesting to consider that protection for the eyes and ears may be appropriate. Do you think a face shield, as some medical workers wear, or even eyeglasses could help?
Yeah, there is the statistics right from the first 6 months showed that they do help. I mean, ideally you want the kind of equipment you described, or surgical goggles. But yeah, I'll tell you another interesting thing about. I have no idea what this means, but the figures are absolutely conclusive, and they've been consistent throughout the entire epidemic so far. Is that the death rate from COVID, and indeed the infection rate from COVID, is far, far lower in those who smoke tobacco than it is in those who don't. And that, by the way, is straight out of the French medical service, including the, as I say, the world famous Pasteur Institute. Now, isn't that an interesting one to consider? In 1970, 2 years after he did the world's first heart transplant, Dr. Christian Barnard wrote a book on the subject of, a huge research project on the subject of viri, contaminants, and tobacco smoking, and actually made the prophecy that when an epidemic came, if it were a viral one, people who smoked would be more likely to get it less badly than people who didn't.
Well, there is a paper from 2021, and this is from BMC Public Health. I've linked to it here, which says the opposite. Smoking is associated with worse outcomes of COVID-19, particularly among younger
adults. Yes, very true. But that's very different from what we're getting from the European statistics. Mm-hmm. So make of it what you will.
Interesting.
Well, how much do you think that has to do with viral load? I mean, and how much does viral load really have to do with it, in general? Because, I mean, if you got somebody breathing right in your face, are you going to get the same as if you just got, a little?
No, you will get a lot more. But viral load is one of the crucial things, as clearly you understand. Yeah, I mean, the nearer the person you are. I mean, I remember back in 2000, it was December the 23rd, 2007. I went to get some very late Christmas shopping, and a woman with a child in a very crowded shop, doing last minute Christmas shopping, as was I, basically coughed straight all over my face. And I got about the worst case of flu the second or third worst case of flu I've ever had. I mean, I was soaked with it. So yeah, viral load, what is called in the initial inoculant, which is the first dose of the virus heavy material you receive. Yeah, that's terribly important. I mean, if you just get a little bit, it actually can act as, in the same way as a vaccine does. It can actually prep your immune system for it. But yeah, get up close to someone who's singing karaoke or something, or, coughing their innards out, unmasked and everything. And yeah, you're going to get it. You're more likely to get it, and you're more likely to get it badly. You're absolutely right.
Yes.
And that's why I'm saying that any steps that you can take, please do. It's not only it's good for you, it's good for your family, and it's good for everybody else. For me, not wearing a mask would be an act of selfishness.
So John H. also points out that people tend to give smokers plenty of social distance these days, so that there may be a correlation there. If people are staying away from smokers, then other people who are COVID positive may be less likely to pass on the infection to the smokers.
Yeah, and of course, smokers, in entertainment establishments are segregated. So that could well explain. It could be very well explained in sociological terms as distinct from medical terms.
Yes, interesting discussion. So there's one more comment that is interesting enough that I want to bring this up. Sergei Gubkin writes, he wonders how did the Russian-speaking community, with a large number of seniors and not following masking or social distancing guidelines, avoid mass deaths in the first wave of COVID. And he wonders what helped the Soviet refugee community and how to apply it to other communities. And this may be a bit anecdotal. I know in Russia itself, there were large numbers of cases and deaths from COVID and similar stories of clinics overflowing with people or beds being placed in stairwells of hospitals because there wasn't enough room. In the United States, in other Western countries to which large numbers of Russian-speaking people have immigrated, I think one of the explanations might be that these communities tend to be fairly tight-knit, but more, let's say, insular with regard to the outside world. And this is especially the case for seniors. So people who come here not knowing the English language very well or preferring to speak Russian, preferring to stay among their group of immigrants, they may not be contacting the outside world as much. So they may not be going to as many large public gatherings. They may be going to gatherings within their communities, but to some extent, those enclaves, by generally sticking to their own circles, might have had a bit more protection early on. Of course, as the virus spreads, as subsequent waves arrive, that effect is going to be less and less prominent. That's my hypothesis, but I welcome any others. All right, I'm not hearing any others. So I would like to move on to the subject of rejuvenation research. And Dr. Hale, if you would give an overview of what your interests in the area are and what you think some promising developments in the recent past have been.
Well, first of all, I should probably explain why I think it's an important thing. I'm a great believer in and this is why I believe in good medical services, because the better they are, the more choices people have. And I think it's very important that people have choices over their lives. I've also got from many years of experience as a medical researcher and scientist. I am strongly of the belief that as machines, if you like, the human body is designed to live a lot longer than it is living currently. I like to use, and I know a lot of people don't like this, and I know it has a lot of flaws to it, but I like to use the analogy of people with motor cars. A really good Mercedes-Benz taken care of will last 1 million miles. The same car neglected, giving low-grade oil, not having its filters changed, etc., will be dead in 100,000 miles. But the car is designed to do 1 million miles. And this is how I feel about rejuvenation. We need to find a way of doing sort of restoration on people. And I believe that we need to present that as quickly as possible. I believe we should do it as a moral imperative, because people should have the choice to live, as long and as healthily as they can, which, a part of that is about educating people in rejuvenation medicine, which we'll come on to later. It is said that every time an old person dies, a library dies with it. If we're ever going to achieve the transhumanist dream of extreme long life, I don't like to use the word immortality, because, how do you define it? You don't. But, extreme longevity, and by that I mean going into a four-figure number of years plus. If we're ever going to achieve that, then we're going to need a lot more consistency of research and of knowledge being not just passed on from one generation to another, but actively taught to one generation after another. And there's a very big difference there. So, from a scientific point of view, we should do this. In terms of the data that doing rejuvenation, call it what you will garner, it's clearly the right thing to do. There have been notable progresses. It's a pity that Dr. Andrews had to leave the meeting early. I mean, I regard Dr. Andrews as one of the great pioneers in anti-aging. I mean, he was the first man to synthesize and make available to people as a en masse human growth hormone. The first man to be able to synthesize telomerase. The first man to do the genetic experimentation to slightly reprogram the genome in hopes of at least slowing up, if not reversing aging, with the participation of patient zero, Liz Andrews.
You mean Liz Parrish?
Andrews is an extraordinary man, and how he's never been given a Nobel Prize, I think, will remain one of life's mysteries. But there we are. I mean, the work of David Sinclair, the work of George Church, the work of Aubrey de Grey, the work of Professor Wang in the University of Seoul in South Korea, Sir John Solston, Professor Watson, Coldstream Harbor Laboratory, clearly genetic reprogramming is what is going to help lead us into extreme life extension. I'm delighted to see the work being done on stem cells, clearly in terms of repairing people who've had heart attacks, people who've been hit by cars, and a lot of other things. Clearly that's going to be very important. We've seen great development in biomed in terms of things like supplementation. And then we got a problem. Despite of all this, average life expectancy in the Western world has either remained static or has, in the case of America, fallen. And also in the case of Russia, in the, from the 1990s onwards, it's beginning to recover. It has recovered to a large degree now, but it for 20 years, it dropped dramatically. So it seemed to me, and I've had an interest in this since I first opened my school my secondary school biology book to chapter 9 at the age of 12 and a half or whatever I was, and read the first sentence I've ever read about genetics. And I've been interested in life extension ever since. And I've been working towards it. You know, I've looked at the biochemical approach, I've looked at the biomed approach, and, you know, clearly these are going to be very, very important. And I've obviously looked at the clinical approaches, and I decided to then look at it from another approach. A mutual friend put myself and Jason Mercurio in contact with each other at Ageless Partners, and we are evolving a rejuvenation system that is unlike anything the world has seen before. It consists of 2 parts, and when we get the investors that we need, you know, we're open for investment now. We have got a brilliant team together. We've got the laboratory facilities that we need. You know, this is no pony and trap show. This is not another, you know, this is not another Theranos or another, well, I think we all know that some regeneration projects have been more, what shall I say, a lot more honest and a lot more well-founded than others. But a look down the list of the people who are with us, including Dr. Andrews, Dr. Jose Cordero, myself, Camilla Isabayeva, Thomas Zayaf from the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, and a number of other people who are very well known. My colleague and friend, Dr. Michaela Green, PhD Human Sciences from Oxford University, Public Health England, one of the lead data collectors that provided the research material for the Jenner Institute to develop Britain's COVID vaccination, and a great deal else as well, you know. So yes, we have got a tremendous team, a unique vision, the determination, and those who invest seriously with us, and we're not interested in crowdfunding or anything like that, will be the ones who will be treated first when we've developed the full system. And, you know, with the level of contribution that we want, they will not be charged for that service. So, yeah, I support rejuvenation. I support regeneration. I support the transhumanist movement and the life extension movement, and now we're doing something about it. And if we get the finance, we'll show you the regenerated subjects within 12 months of today.
Thank you for those remarks, Dr. Hale. And I'm curious if Jason Mercurio has anything to add, since this is a collaboration between the two of you.
Thanks, JD. Appreciate it. You know, I think the thing that in the aging and rejuvenation space that we've seen this a lot. We've seen really a lot of lifespan studies on rats, worms, and, you know, other species. And really, when you do a lifespan study, the issue is that, you know, you basically have to wait for that species to die to really make some kind of conclusion or inference. But when you do rejuvenation or you target age reversal, you know, you're going to know if something works right away, pretty much. And so, you know, we can effectively measure the biological age of all 78 organs across the 11 main organ systems. And so you have like your circulatory system, you have your nervous system, you have your skeletal system, you have your muscles, you know, your muscular system. And each one can be targeted with a different method. And each one has a biological age, each part of your body actually. And there's variation. For example, your skin ages much faster than your brain. Um, and you can see that visually. You can see people who are, still cognitively aware, but their skin, has aged quite a bit. So um, there's nothing really that says we can't take someone who's older, who's an elder, who's a baby boomer, and revert them back. Actually, all the way back, I believe is possible, and we're seeing that even in different studies. Like for example, the paper that came out recently, David Sinclair, he basically showed. Now he showed it in rats, but really he showed that the aging mechanism is more malleable than we originally thought. And his theory is actually that there's this information, this epigenetic information that is lost over time. And the question is, can we bring that information back? And is there a backup copy of youth in every single cell? Now, he's saying there is, and I think he's correct. I mean, I think that, there's obviously multiple ways to look at it. I'm sure there's some people who may disagree with his conceptualization, but at the end of the day, I mean, he's kind of shown it. I mean, he's kind of shown that this works, and it seems pretty robust. I think that there's the cells. Like one cell is actually pretty complicated, the number of components, but as we advance our technology, we'll be able to engineer things smaller and smaller. And eventually our nanotechnology will actually bring us where we really need to be. I mean, really, we need nanotechnology, and we need the AIs to help leverage those tools for a full age reversal, which I think will be possible. But in the interim, essentially, we've come up with some methods and some tools to bring people back without, not completely back, across all 11 organ systems, right? In particular, the immune system is very complex, many interrelated parts, but we're targeting primarily the circulatory system and the muscular system, and a couple others, but really, like, the number one age-related disease is really cardiovascular disease to some degree. Now, some people might say, "Oh, it's cancer or it's dementia," and all these diseases are bad. But as the cardiovascular system breaks down, that is a key driver of aging, of degradation, and we can essentially reverse that process, putting it in the other direction. And there's so many pieces of equipment that are involved to do that, and a lot of them, we're going to create several new ones, and there's already a lot that already exists. But we're not looking for something incremental. We're not looking to take someone who's 89 and flip them to 87, because really that's not going to help them. I mean, a little bit, yes, but we want to take what we can do: diet, exercise, nutrition, fasting, building muscle, and sort of stack on top of that another layer of tools that can really help people become the best versions of themselves, to be stronger, to be faster, to be smarter, using the tools of today. I mean, we see these tools that are coming into existence, like ChatGPT, for example, other AI systems, and a wide variety of tools. And we want to use everything we can to build this better future and to rejuvenate ourselves and the ones we care about. So thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Jason, for those remarks. And we have a bit of feedback from our viewers. John H. thinks this is good news for boomers. Maybe more people from the boomer generation will be okay as a result of these emerging research approaches. Now, Alan Crowley wonders, how does one get tested for the biological age of one's organs and systems? What are the options that are available right now, and how reliable do you think they are?
Yeah, sure. It's pretty complicated. Right now, you can get an epigenetics age test, and you could test what is the age of your blood, and that test is sort of the the cutting edge. That one is pretty straightforward, and there's several testing facilities like True Diagnostic, and if you look up online biological age testing, you'll find probably a bunch. Now, for specific organs and organ systems, this is where it gets more complicated, right? Because here's the issue. Say you're trying to test the biological age of a liver. Well, are you going to take someone's liver and take some of that tissue out and actually say, oh, this liver, is 40, or this liver is 79? Not, that would not be something you would want to do. And essentially, we found out that there's actually a way to determine the biological age of your organs, of your organ systems, by looking in the blood. It turns out that when you think about a liver or a spleen or any of these organ systems, they're all producing proteins. And when you look at the proteome, you can determine based on those proteins what is the biological age of that organ. So each organ produces these, and we can essentially quantify those and measure those. Thanks.
Yes, thank you, Jason, for your response to that question. And now I would like to turn it over to the other panelists to see if you have any questions for Dr. Hale with regard to either his discussion of rejuvenation research or his prior comments about the pandemic. And let us spend about 10 minutes on the question and answer session for those components before we delve into neurodiversity.
I'm kind of curious as to what Dr. Hale thinks about the demographics problem that some of these developed countries may be facing here in the future. Normally the demographics are like this, where there's not very many old people on top and there's a whole lot of young people on the bottom. And as the countries have modernized and industrialized, it causes us to have less kids. So, some of our demographics are like chimneys now. We got like almost the same amount. But there are some countries that are going to be in a bad way, even worse than us in the United States. They're going to have not enough young people and too many old people. And I'm wondering, do you think that might have an effect on like maybe the amount of funding and just how serious? Because, there's only so many answers to a demographic problem. You had to have had kids 20 years ago. We already know what we're going to get, so there's only so many answers to that, problem. And I imagine that, longevity would be a good answer, because then them old people are back in the workforce. Really, they're back being productive.
That's one of the main reasons we want to do it, because right now, you spoke about the United States, and I can speak about the United Kingdom, where we're seeing that exact problem that you described. And the fact is that we have got a diminishing workforce paying higher taxes to support an increasing number of increasingly frail older people. And sooner or later, that chimney, brilliant description, is going to topple over. And the best way, it seems to us, is to make that older age group much fitter. Think of the savings just to the health services. Okay, it's bad news if you've got a family of undertakers, but for health services, for social services, think of all that extra experience that will go back into the workforce. Every possible way you look at regeneration, rejuvenation, anti-aging, whatever. And I know we use different terms on, our respective sides of the Atlantic. It's a win-win-win for everyone. And we have a system that actually will do the job. Now, what will happen in 50 years' time? Well, at least we'll have 50 years to think about it.
Yes, thank you for that response. And I completely agree. It is imperative to extend people's lifespans and the periods of time people spend in good health, because that is not only going to help those individuals, it is going to help our broader society, our broader economy. It is going to preserve those vast amounts of knowledge and experience and talent that would otherwise be needlessly extinguished. So rejuvenation is a tremendous part of solving these demographic issues that Jason spoke of. Now, let us turn to Art Ramon Garcia to see what question he would have.
Yeah, sort of piggybacking on the study that David Sinclair did. So he was saying that there's epigenetic, the process itself is a breakdown of the epigenetic process and how it does repairs. So that's in the cellular DNA. So does mitochondrial DNA have its own epigenetic capability? And if it does, is that something we need to also study?
Yeah.
Yes and yes.
Yeah, just to expand on that a little bit, you know, the mitochondria is actually more complex than people think. There's actually multiple components in the mitochondria, including the mitochondrial DNA. And in fact, the mitochondrial DNA tends to mutate, and to actually fix those mutations is incredibly difficult. And one of the common misconceptions with mitochondria as well is that, you know, there's like one in a cell, but really it's a whole ecosystem. In every single cell, there's this ecosystem of mitochondria, and you know, sometimes there's hundreds, if not thousands, of mitochondria in a single cell. And within just one of those components, there's, you know, within one mitochondria, there's so many parts to it. So in terms of like, is there an epigenome? Is there another layer on top of the mitochondrial DNA? Probably. Like the reading and writing capabilities of the cell probably degrades over time. I'm not sure if David Sinclair has made that claim, and I'm pretty sure we probably don't know yet either. Like some of that stuff, it's so small, and making that determination, I'm guessing we haven't really, you know, been able to scientifically prove there's, you know, some of those parts, but I'm sure that there's work to be done there for sure.
Yeah, if I can jump in there a moment, Jason, I have seen. I'm a member of the HGP, the Human Genome Project, and I've seen evidence that backs up exactly what you said about the epigenetic memory within the mitochondria. I said to the gentleman yes and yes, because I've seen enough evidence that I, for one, am convinced that Dr. Sinclair's hypothesis would indeed extend into that. And it's something I've got very much on my mind as we develop the technology and the protocol for our rejuvenation system. Because as you rightly pointed out, the importance of the mitochondria.
Yes, interesting. Thank you. And we have one more question in regard to the subject of rejuvenation, and then I want to provide sufficient time to discuss neurodiversity as well. So Daniel Tweet asks, currently, what % incomplete would you estimate our understanding of the human immune system to be? Would either you, Dr. Hale, or Jason Mercurio care to comment on this?
I mean, I would say like it's probably more incomplete than is complete. You know, there's this tendency for things in biology and for humans to think, oh, we got all this figured out, but really we don't. There's much more that we don't know than we do know. So, you know, I would say like our understanding is probably 99% incomplete, and we understand 1%. But you know, it's hard to say. It's just a guess.
Interestingly enough, in our chat, John H. was also suggesting that our understanding might be 99% incomplete. So that was a fortuitous alignment, and he suggests that the immune system might be like an onion in terms of finding more as one peels off layer after layer after layer. So interesting thoughts there. And also, several of us are curious whether you have any sort of website, any sort of link that you could share in regard to the rejuvenation system that you're working on.
Nothing yet. We don't have anything posted on publicly on the website about that yet. We're still kind of putting together, the plan and the components. But if you feel free to reach out if you want to see, we're developing some pitch decks, but it's all kind of in the works. We're still in the early stages. So, yeah.
All right. Thank you for that response. And now I would like to turn it over to
If I
Dr.
could just
Hale.
make one
Yes.
mention there, Gennady. Yeah, Jason's a little too modest to admit it, but he asked people to reach out to us, and I'd like to echo that. I would also like to echo what John H. and Jason said, that yeah, maybe we know 1% now, which is another reason why we're doing this project. But yeah, we're a little publicity shy because as I've said before, what we're doing is unlike anything that's been done before. So there are levels of security and secrecy to protect ourselves and our future investors. So yeah, we're not making a big song and dance about it at the moment. But yeah, please feel free to speak about us, and we're available for people who we're not shunning people, but right now we're so intense and working on getting this made entirely ready and completing our team that we're not we're not making a big publicity drive at this point. I mean, we have made huge steps, and Jason's a little too modest to admit it, but that's the situation. But yeah, people who are really serious and interested, and who want to be a please feel that you can reach out to us. We're not kind of stuffy people. We're just very focused and very, very busy people right now. So sorry for the 2 minutes, Gennady, but I just wanted to add that.
If people do want to reach out to you, what is the best way?
If someone wants to reach out, they can reach out to me. A lot of people will have my email, even just directly on our website. There's a way to contact us. LinkedIn's fine as well. So
agelesspartners.com?
Yes.
All right. I will.
You got a Discord
put that
too,
in the
don't
chat.
you?
Say that again.
You got a Discord too, don't you?
Yes, we also have a Discord channel as well. Yeah, I can share that in the chat as well if people want to just join. And really, I mean, we in general, like the core theme of Ageless Partners is it's forming partnerships around the world with people with a common mission. At the end of the day, like we all age, we all need to slow down and effectively reverse our aging, or everyone will be gone. So we're fairly open, in terms of that, and our Discord channel. I can share it with you, Gennady. You can drop it in there. It's if people want to come in and ask us questions, and that'd be fine.
All right. Well, thank you for that, Jason. And you can see here, agelesspartners.com is the website. I will share the Discord link when it becomes available. And now I will turn the floor over back to Dr. Hale. Please provide us an overview of your work in neurodiversity and what you have learned during your many years of study in that area.
Yeah, well, my years of study of neurodiversity began the moment I was born, because I'm neurodiverse myself. And basically, neurodiversity means being born with a different brain. There's a really great guy called Dr. Harold Hackey Reitman, who has an organization called differentbrains.com. And I urge everybody to look at that foundation that he set up. Guy's got an incredible life story, and you know, he's quite extraordinary. You know, I've also done a lecture at Touro Law School for the Institute of Jewish Law, the head of Professor Samuel Levine, as well as numerous other broadcasts. And I've written a book about it, which is a great book, and I'm looking for a new publisher for it, because publishing hasn't gone well, but it's basically found its way into a lot of universities and everything. Now it needs a publisher to take it to the general public, which is what I always intended. Neurodiversity basically means being born with a brain different from normal. And by different, I mean a different size, a different shape, different chemical structure, different electrical structure, you know, or whatever. That's what makes people neurodiverse. You know, it's not a disease. You can't catch it, although mostly it's inherited. I managed to get access to my paternal family's records going back to the middle of the 18th century, and reading their correspondence and their poetry. I'm a very keen poet, by the way, and I'm a published poet, and you know, I've had 1 or 2 awards for my poetry. You've got the scientist on one side and the poet on the other. You know, kind of like Einstein was, you know, a brilliant cosmologist, but he was also a really very good violinist as well. You know, Leonardo was, you know, a great painter and sculptor, but he was also one of the finest mechanical engineers that's ever lived, you know, devising all the different machinery that he did. So you'll find with neurodiverse people that most of them have got at least 2 sides to them. You know, that kind of very, you know, kind of very yin yang balance, I guess you might want to call it. I don't know. Another really great example of a very neurodiverse person and a total genius was Jim Morrison, who was the lyricist, poet, and you know, rock star of the 60s and 70s. And you know, you had the kind of wild man on one side, which he definitely could be, and you read some of the most, you know, touching and sensitive poetry and innovative filmmaking. He was a graduate of the UCLA Film School. You know, genius level IQ. You know, but who also loved fast cars as well. So you've got all those kind of different things going on. And Mike Lezina's just written in, yes, Da Vinci was into studying the human body and autopsying. So there we are. So yeah, but the problem is that the people who are neurodiverse make up about 1% of the population, and as a result, we are misunderstood, underrepresented, undercared about, undersupported, unappreciated. You know, it's extraordinary that the modern world was created by neurodiverse people like Bill Gates. He's never made any secret about his Asperger's. You know, Steve Jobs never made any secret about his. We know that Nikola Tesla, Leonardo, Michelangelo, Mozart, Einstein, Virginia Woolf, Sylvia Plath. I could go on and on and on. You know, Bill Murray, Daryl Hannah, you know, Elon Musk. You know, all have that same neurodiverse diagnosis. You know, and people ask me, well, how do you know that Leonardo was, neurodiverse? He's been dead 600 years or whatever it might be. Well, the truth is that we do know a lot of the genetic patterns and sequences. We know a lot about the chromosomes, that the genes that go together to make the different types of neurodiversities look like. And if we take samples from, normally I would take from the teeth if I can get hold of them, or from bone, and we can from that reconstruct their genome, and we can see what neurodiversity they had. I don't know, a lot of you may be aware that King Richard III of England was recently discovered, his grave was recently discovered, or they thought that it was. And they were able to remove some remains from the ground and get a genetic sample, even though he had been murdered in 1385. And they were able to trace through his elder sister, Anne of York, a living relative, a gentleman in Canada. And they checked the DNA against, and yes, the remains were those of Richard III. And when they took the skull and reconstructed his face and put it next to the face of the guy from nearly 700 years ago who had provided that DNA sample, almost identical. The power of our genes is staggering. So make no bones about it that neurodiversity it runs in families, very much so. And it's not a mental illness, and sometimes it's sometimes it's a superpower, sometimes it's very, very isolating. And with autism, it's you live in a very high state of anxiety, which is tiring. We know that people with neurodiversities suffered particularly high losses during COVID, because basically nobody cares about us because we're a minority. We don't really count when it comes to votes. But because neurodiversity is genetically inherited, it is a whole body condition. It's not just that we have different brains, we have different bodies. We now know about the enteric nervous system, what some people like to call the little brain or the second brain, which is about 200 to 400 million neurons that line the entire length of our gut, from our esophagus to exit point, in two layers. They're like that, one layer on top of the other, and they're connected to the main brain in the head, and those are the first two things to develop: the brain and the gut, and then the spine, which is also an extension of the brain. And the result of that is that people with neurodiverse conditions also have a lot of comorbidities. And I know John H., when we were talking about COVID, talked about comorbidities on a couple of occasions, and that's exactly it. People with autism in particular always suffer from gut problems, GIT, gastrointestinal tract problems. I mean, I have a number of allergies and food intolerances myself. I have a very boring diet. I have to be very careful about what I eat and what I drink, and what I don't eat and drink as well. Yeah, but what I'm asking for all the time is for people to understand neurodiversity, people to understand the effects, both positive and negative, on the individual, to be more supportive of us and to be a damn sight more appreciative. Pardon my language, but as I say, people like Tesla, Edison was neurodiverse, people like that. These were the people, Brunel, it was these people who built the modern world, and Mozart. I mean, look what Mozart gave us, and look at 50 years on. Obviously being involved with universities, if I walk past a university, student hall of residence, there's every, anytime I do that, you can bet that I'll hear someone playing the doors, because people with neurodiversities, they make a difference in whatever field they go into. And Art Ramon Paintings has just said about being a night owl. Yeah, a lot of neurodiverse people are. I am, and it's a disadvantage, and it's at times. Me, I love the night. It gives me the time. It's where I do my thinking. When all the world lies hushed and fallen, is the way that I think of it, and there's a lot less kind of static in the air. I think you can think more clearly at night. Because one of the problems with neurodiversity is, very high sensory sensitivity, and of course at night it's all dark and all the rest of it. And being a night owl has its advantages. I know that when I was working my way through college, during the holidays, I worked night shift in a factory, and that was great because I was quite happy sleeping during the day. And I'm working during the night and getting paid twice as much as people doing the same job during the day. So, yeah, it can have its advantages, but all round, it isn't a problem. It's not my neurodiversity that's a problem for me, man. The problem is society and other people's attitude to my neurodiversity. That's what my problem is. Because we're not very good at the social side of life. We're certainly not very good at the financial side of life. We're very open and honest and very easily conned. Someone with autism is kind of the perfect patsy. I guess it would be too political to mention a name, but a certain figure associated with a well-known 20th century assassination was autistic. Let me put it that way. So there's all that as well, and this is why I've written this guideline book. I based it on the structure of the guide to the London Underground system, and what you'd call the subway system, and I've done that. So yeah, and I hope it will soon be published by a big mainstream publisher, and that everybody will be able to read it, as a pretty cheap download or paperback. I mean, the book on COVID, it's a treatise, really. It's only sort of 30 or whatever pages, and it's 99 cents on Smashwords, and it really does explain the history of COVID, and and how we need to reorganize our societal priorities to protect ourselves against it and future outbreaks. And in the same way as in this book, I've said how to help people with neurodiversity achieve their full potential. I find it very, very inspiring that companies like SAP, Microsoft, IBM have realized that people with neurodiversities do have a unique contribution to make, and that these forward-thinking companies, and I know Pfizer do this as well, are going out into the community and actually recruiting, actually bringing people into their family and giving people that kind of stability. And I know someone who's one of the top programmers for Xbox, who was who was brought in by Microsoft in exactly that manner, and being brought in from the cold, so to speak. And that's really what I think we need to be doing.
Yes. All right, Dr. Hale, thank you very much. Unfortunately, we are out of time for our salon, but we appreciated your overview of neurodiversity and the benefits that neurodiverse individuals can bring to our society and our civilization. And certainly this is something that needs to be appreciated a lot more. Thank you to Jason Mercurio and Dr. Bill Andrews for joining us as well. Thank you to our U.S. Transhumanist Party officers and our quite engaged audience as usual. And until next time, I hope that we all live long and prosper.
Thank you. It's been